Biofriendly Podcast. It's the Biofriendly Podcast.
The most comfortable podcast
in the world.
Well, I picked up on the low-key thing because when I got the first email, I thought, okay, who are these guys? So I went and listened to it, and I thought, oh my God, this couldn't be any more different from what I do. I try to cram like 3 hours of content in my 4-minute podcast, which is actually broadcast on the radio here in Alberta. And it's pretty much the opposite approach.
Yeah. Well, that's why I was excited to have you on the show. And once we discovered your podcast and learned about you, so let's just dive right in.
Let's say that's the starting point.
That was the starting point. I think that David opening up with that line right there is the best way to introduce.
Yes, the contrast between our shows.
Yes.
Trying to put all the knowledge in 4 minutes versus trying to give as little knowledge as possible in 40.
Yes. Your words.
Yes, our words. Hey, we claim it proudly. Welcome to the Biofriendly Podcast. I'm Jacob.
And I'm Noel.
And today we're welcoming David Dodge, who is the host of Green Energy Futures podcast and also a environmental journalist, photojournalist, has quite a long history in the environmental scene. So would you mind telling us a little bit about your background?
Oh my gosh. I'm a forester by education. I studied forestry in university. Why? Awesome. I have no idea why. I wanted to work outdoors, and the counselor in high school said, well, you should try forestry.
There it is.
So I signed up. I thought it was great. And I started working for a newspaper while I was still in university as a columnist and as a news photographer, as a photojournalist. And I just loved it. I mean, who wouldn't like making $10 per picture published? That was the pay rate of my first gig.
Wow.
So, there were months I made $20. So why wouldn't you want to do that?
What a month, right?
What a month.
That's
I love
hilarious.
it.
Sorry, you asked about background. But while I was at that paper, it was really interesting because we were also had a printing press at the paper. I worked at the St. Albert Gazette, which is a small weekly in one of the suburb communities of Edmonton. Very great newspaper, by the way. And weeklies are still relevant in contrast to other newspapers. Yeah. But anyways, we had a printing press, and we were printing the newsletter for something called the Canadian Parks and Wilderness Society. And so I was reading it, and they advertised for an executive director, and I was 20-something at that time and wholly unqualified. But I thought, what the heck, I'll apply. I really love wilderness. I like parks. And so I applied and didn't get the job. But the person they did hire didn't show up.
Really?
And so they called me, and they said, well, we'd like to try you out. And so that's kind of how I got started. I was the first paid staff member of the Canadian Parks and Wilderness Society in Alberta. And worked for various groups since then, the Pembina Institute, which is an energy policy institute here in Canada. And I've worked for publishers. I was a production manager of a nature publisher in Canada that produced, what city are you guys in?
Pasadena, California, just near Los Angeles.
Well, we did Birds of LA, and I know we did Birds of San Francisco, and I know we did Birds of Seattle, but I don't know about Pasadena.
Yeah,
we have parrots that are specific to Pasadena. Well, they're not supposed to be specific to Pasadena, but there was a fire in a pet shop up in the hills above us in this little place called Altadena, and a bunch of parrots got out. They were able to escape, and they were successful. So now we have our Pasadena parrots.
We have our very own Pasadena parrots here.
Well, that's better than house sparrows, which we imported from Britain.
Right. Yeah, I was gonna. You listed off the Canada background, so for our listeners, David is our northern neighbor up there in Canada, and so have you been there your whole life, born and raised?
Yeah, I'm really stuck where I am. I'm in Edmonton, Alberta, which is the most northerly big city in the Western Hemisphere. I'm kind of happy to point out. Not happy that I live here like every day.
Gets a bit cold, maybe.
But I have 5 kids and a long history. Wow. I'm sitting in a cabin that my grandfather built a cabin at a lake before there were even roads to the lake in 1919. And so my roots here are so deep. I've rebuilt the cabin since then, but I'm still there. I'm still in the same neighborhood. My grandparents had an acreage, which is now inner city, but used to be in the country.
Wow. So it's expanding fast up there, huh?
Yeah.
That's great.
Well,
Wow.
and you're joined by a giraffe. For people who are watching the podcast, he's got a giraffe up there, a portrait of a giraffe behind you, but you said it was something else.
Well, it's really got nothing to do with this story whatsoever, except it's a photo I really love. As a photographer, I was in South Africa about 1.5 years ago, and this was from Kruger National Park, I believe. And the photo is not of a giraffe. It's of the bird above the giraffe. And if you actually were able to zoom in on it, which we can't, in spite of the name Zoom, the bird is an oxpecker. And an oxpecker is a bird that lives on the backs of water buffalo and rhinos and giraffes, and they live on the bugs that really bug the big animals. So they have a very symbiotic relationship. So they eat all the mites and ticks and nasty things that try to live on the backs of big animals.
Wow. So big animals are actually searching these guys out.
They
live
don't
with
mind them.
Yeah, you don't
Rock
mind.
and roll.
Symbiotic relationships in
totally.
nature.
That's great.
We don't mind tangents. We embrace them wholeheartedly on this show. So if we find ourselves talking about giraffes or birds that are eating mites off giraffes, we wholly embrace it.
Or log cabins or anything.
Or log
frankly.
cabins
It's-
and
it's-
roads and familial history. No, that's great. We are here in Los Angeles. Have you actually ever been down to this part of the U.S. before?
I have. When I was young, I thought I would tour the world, which to me was between here and Tijuana and back. So I actually drove down through central U.S. and Utah, all those national parks, in Arizona, went over to San Diego, walked into Tijuana, and then drove all the way up the coast in a Honda Civic. And it was during the time of the oil crisis in the 1970s. Wow. And Americans were very mad at me because you guys, for whatever reason then, you had a different president then. At the time, during the gas crisis, you guys were lined up for gas, but for some crazy reason, they would let the tourists go to the front of the line despite the grumbling.
Really?
And so that's an interesting little side story. But here's the best part. I drove to Tijuana and back on $110 worth of gas.
Oh my goodness!
Wow.
Times have changed, that's for sure.
Wow. Well, that's. I wanted to say that now. The new thing will be how long can people get their battery to last? Like how far can you make that battery go? Like,
Right.
What kind of distance? How many refills do you need to get to Tijuana and back? Like do I have to recharge 2 times, 3 times? That'd be it's nice to see the world changing that way. But that'll be the new conversation that people talk about.
Well, the cool thing is, as you probably know, there's an app for that.
There
right.
you go. There's an app for everything.
App for everything.
Yeah. So how did you get into green energy futures? What kind of put you in that direction?
I spent a number of years as the communications director for the Pembina Institute, which is an institute that works on energy policy in Canada. And I worked on climate change, oil sands impacts on the environment, conventional energy impacts on the environment, a little bit on renewable energy, energy efficiency. And, that's like bump and grind hard work. You do that as a service to society, but you don't do it because, you love every minute of it. Those are nasty issues. They're hard issues. And while I was doing that work, I came to this realization about 10 years ago. I'd be reading the newspaper locally, and I'm sure it wasn't much different from your newspapers. And when they would do stories about solar or geothermal or something like that, it'd be about how flaky it is, how expensive it is, how pointless it is. And I already knew at that time that, these things had a lot of potential, these alternative energies, which were so-called at the time. And so I was so appalled by the way they were treated in the media. I thought, I had this crazy idea. I sat down and I wrote this little 5-page vision. If I could do anything in my life right now, what would it be? The kind of thing you do for therapy. Yeah. And then reality sinks in and you realize you can't do it and you go out and get a regular job. But in this case, I wrote up the vision, and my vision was to travel across Canada to find the most inspiring people doing the most inspiring projects. And I called the area that I would operate in green energy. Because it didn't mean anything and it was wide open. It would let me do buildings and transportation and energy itself. And lo and behold, you're going to find this funny. I took this vision to a company called Suncor Energy, which is now one of the biggest oil sands and oil companies in Canada. They actually subsumed Petro-Canada. Like, it's just a giant company. And they loved the vision, much to my surprise. And I spent
that is surprising.
I spent about $1.3 or $4 million of their money and TD Bank's money and Shell Canada's money traveling the country, telling these stories. And I was so dumb and idealistic at the time. I said, there's 3 rules in this project. 1, I will never do stories about you. 2, I will never do stories about conventional energy. And 3, I will never do stories about carbon capture and storage, because that'll be adequately covered somewhere else, and it's a morass of politics. I wanted to cover the potential of all these alternative energies to transform the world, which really did seem kind of almost crazy at the time, and has now turned out to be not so crazy.
Yeah. I love that. I love that because you had some hard terms in there for doing this, and they agreed. They went with it.
It really was a recipe to be unemployed when you think about it.
Yeah, for sure.
But it makes sense though, because if you're going to do something like that, you want to be able to capture people's imagination. You want to be able to start striking into places where others aren't looking, and to see what new and inspiring and exciting things exist. And that doesn't, the stuff you weren't willing to do, that's the past. That's the past, or that's areas that we maybe, know a bit more about or understand a little better. So it's kind of, I like that idea of, we're going to go and strike out and find the inspiring stories, the unusual stories. We're going to find out how people are being incredibly clever about figuring out this problem of clean energy.
Yeah,
that's neat.
Well, when I dug into Green Energy Futures, it shows, if you go into the the podcast, which is our way of consuming it. You said it was on the radio up there.
Yeah, so actually, this goes back to the beginning of our story, and I'm sure the beginning of your story. How do you get people to listen to you in the beginning?
Yeah.
It's difficult. And right away you learn that all of the podcast software is simply software to host something. It doesn't get you a single listener.
Right,
exactly.
And so my secret weapon, and I had a long-time affiliation with this network. It's called the CKUA Radio Network in Alberta, and it's one of the only listener-supported radios in Canada. So It's almost all listener-supported. Listeners donate money. That's how it survives. And I had a relationship with them before. I produced a 300-part series on sustainability prior to that. And I went to them and I said, I have this new vision of green energy futures. And they were a little skeptical, but they trusted me. And so my secret weapon was I would gather video stories for YouTube. I would write blogs on my channel, and then I would take the same audio from those video interviews and turn them into podcasts for radio, the 4-minute radio features. So the length of my podcast is 4 minutes, not because I thought that was good for the internet. It's probably not the best for the internet, but it's perfect for radio, and it's exactly what they asked for. So I've been doing that, and even though I've got 250 episodes, I've probably done 350 podcasts for CKUA Radio. And the great thing about radio is on YouTube, I have to attract you somehow and then get you to watch it.
Sure.
My blog, I've got to draw you in somehow from Facebook or LinkedIn or wherever and get you to read my blog. On radio, nobody tunes in to listen to me. It's a 4-minute radio feature. The odds of you tuning in at the right time are 0. But eventually, every single listener in the radio network, 500,000 people, hear the podcast. And so that's my way of reaching the great unwashed.
That is very, very cool. I'm glad you specified about the length of time of the show, because if you go into iTunes and you look at the history of the show, you see it started in 2012. Is that correct, or is that just when they started being published?
That was the pilot. No, I started this series in 2012.
2012. So you go back to 2012, and you can see that the first few are 1 minute. Long, and then it gets up to 4 minutes, and then the consistency. I was scrolling up and I see 4 minutes literally since 2013, pretty much. And I thought, here's our podcast that we target that 30, 45 minute window. But if you were to scroll
very
through,
rough.
Yeah, very rough. we knew when we started this show, we were like, well, we want that window of time for the internet, and for, we're not on the radio out here. We wanted that drivable time, people sitting in their commutes, somebody on their way to work. We thought about the 30, 40 minute window, especially in LA, would be perfect. But we overshoot, we undershoot, we're all over the map. But now it makes sense to why you're always 4 minutes. It's for that specific broadcast time. So is that difficult to squeeze it in there?
Funny story, because if it's not 4 minutes, it doesn't run. It's pretty much that simple.
There it
Oh,
is.
it's that simple, right? Right.
But the 1 minute story, it did start as 1 minute. And, it was funny because when I did the stories on sustainability, the previous series called The Eco File, it was a 20-minute radio show, and it had a news component, a feature component. It was really cool. But they wanted to get away from that. CKUA is a music network. It's known for music. And,
really?
so they don't want you diving out of the music for too long. And so they said, well, just do 1 minute. So I started doing 1 minute. And then CKUA hired a new program manager, and he was about to fire me because he said, those things just sound like ads. And I said, well, that's because they are. In 1 minute, all I can do is an ad for a story. And
right.
if it was up to me, I'd do it longer. And he said, well, that's a good idea. Why don't you do it 4 minutes? Well, that's not a lot longer, but it's a lot better. You can tell a pretty good story in 4 minutes.
Yeah, that is cool. That is cool. So that's how it kind of evolved into being that time frame. But yeah, when you go through, and I've listened to some of the shows, it is amazing how much you've perfected getting to a topic, getting in and getting out in that time frame. So I thought that was very, very cool. What has been along the way some of the standout moments for you while doing this? Like stories that you've covered, places that you saw across your country that really have stuck with you?
Oh my gosh, that's like asking which is your favorite child.
Right. It's probably so hard because if I go on your YouTube, you of course can see the ones that rose to the top, but I was really curious as to which ones for you stood out.
I really wasn't interested in buildings. When I started this, I wasn't interested at all until I discovered that buildings are really big when it comes to climate change emissions and that it's pretty easily solvable. And so I started to find stories about people doing unusual things with buildings. And I could pick 100 stories here that are my favorites, but sure. The idea of making a net zero building, a building that produces all of its own energy on a net annual basis, or a passive house building, these ideas all get combined. I got to meet Michael Reynolds. Do you know Michael Reynolds?
I don't.
So Michael Reynolds is a rebel architect from New Mexico, and he started building Earthships 40 years ago. Earthships are made out of recycled beer cans and tires, and you stuff them with dirt, and you make basically a house that's surrounded by the earth on 3 sides, so it's super insulated, and it's got kind of a greenhouse on the front, and it's totally passive heated, using passive heat coming through the greenhouse. And it's a terrific idea, and it was one of the early passive house designs, but totally alternative. I mean, you couldn't build these in neighborhoods in the city, but he became something of a folk hero. But eventually he lost his architect's license because he was building illegal subdivisions out in the desert in New Mexico.
Rebel.
The Green Rebellion lives on.
Yeah.
But he got his license back because he was such a folk hero.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Nice.
But the cool thing is, the guy that I worked with to start this series, I hired this young guy. He was smarter than I am. His name was Duncan Kinney, and he was really committed to this stuff. And him and his father decided they were going to build an Earthship. And in fact, they built the first Michael Reynolds official Earthship here in Alberta that was certified or finished about 6 years ago or so, 5 years ago. Michael Reynolds has a company now, and he's still around. He has a company called Earthship Biotecture. And you can hire him and his crew to come up and help you build your Earthship. And so the Kinneys did that. And so I have photos of Michael Reynolds, who's now, I think he must be in his 70s, laying the rocks at the entrance to the Earthship in southern Alberta. Just like that's what he does. It was pretty cool meeting him. And I'll never forget his opening. Because I asked him kind of a crazy question, did you do this just to spite the man or something like that? I tried to ask him some kind of hippie question at least in my mind. And I don't care about the man. And it was perfect because he launched into this little tirade off the top, and it was just classic Michael Reynolds. And it was one of my favorite moments for sure.
Oh, I love
great.
it. That's great. And what a great name, Earthship. That right there just sounds cool. You're immediately sucked in when you hear the name Earthship.
Well, if you live in an Earthship,
Yeah,
it does. It's
yeah.
like it makes you cooler immediately, right?
Immediately.
Yeah.
I love it. I love it because I saw some of the popular ones. There was a YouTube that gotten a lot of views about a guy who had that. I think his also may have been called an Earthship, or correct me if I'm wrong. It's probably your second most popular video. It's that place that was self-sustaining, solar-powered, way up in the middle of somewhere in Canada. It's like open, freezing cold, and he's got
You're talking about the same Earthship. So here's a lesson in social media. We did our first story on the Earthship 4 or 5 years ago when it was being built. And, it did okay. It got, maybe a couple 100,000 views or something. And then people kept sending Duncan, my colleague, notes and letters and emails and whatever, and asking him, so how's it doing the Canadian winter? And so I thought, okay, let's do a story. I'll come and stay with you for a couple of days, and we'll do a story about surviving in an Earthship in the cold, desolate Canadian winter. And we use that as the headline. And, I knew that was a good idea, but that video has 3 times the views of the original video.
How about that, right? It's all about those keywords that people are going to click on and be like, I've got to know, cold, desolate, how will you survive?
Well, I mean, this is why companies spend so much money on branding and on messaging and on how, on surveying the right phrases to see if they can find that secret, right? Because it is people, if you get the right words, people just go.
And I think I've got a lot of American viewers in that one. I think the cold, desolate Canadian winter kind of resonates with them for some reason.
Yeah, right, for sure.
Well, our imagination of pretty much everywhere else is that it's much more difficult than we think it is. I know that. So I'm Australian. I don't sound like it, but my family's Australian. But pretty much anyone I tell that I'm Australian, they say, "Oh my God, how do you live down there? Everything's trying to kill you." Right. Well, so that's the American perspective. I mean, when you live there, you're like, well, not really, right? But if you live up here, you think, oh, you have the snakes and the spiders and the crocodiles, and you're just going to die if you live there.
Yeah.
And I think the same kind of thing applies to some degree in Canada. It's like, well, if you go too far north in Canada, you just die, don't you?
You just freeze to death. Everybody looks like Jack Nicholson at the end of The Shining, just frozen to death. So.
Well, that's pretty much sums it up.
Yeah.
That's funny. So you said you got into it originally through forestry because you wanted to be outside, and then green energy sort of took over. But at this point in your life, what environmental topics excite you the most? Like what about this industry or this business, I guess, excites you the most?
It's pretty simple, really. I'm a little bit of a political beast, and I don't mean in a hard, party supporting way. But I think about issues and how they affect how society is progressing a lot. And in the beginning, when I took the job with the Canadian Parks and Wilderness Society, I thought wilderness and parks were like the ultimate thing, wild ecosystems are where life all came from. And if there's anything that's important on Earth, it's those wild ecosystems of which we are products of. So when in my youth, that was the big deal. I eventually came to realize that it's energy that makes the world go round. So just about everything in the geopolitics of the world centers around energy. And so energy in the environment, energy in politics, energy in religion, just about everything that's contentious or positive or negative in the world goes back to energy on some level. And so when I realized that, I kind of married my environmental interest by being interested in renewable energy and energy that has low impact. The rest came pretty naturally after that. So I started to really get enamored with it. But I have to say, it's the people that I've met. I meet people that are so inspiring. You could go out and you could start a podcast series about entrepreneurs. And you could interview entrepreneurs because they're entrepreneurs and they're driven and they never give up and they fail 2 or 3 times and eventually they succeed and you have a good story. But these entrepreneurs that I meet are doubly inspiring because they're successful entrepreneurs, but they're mission driven. I would say almost 100% of them. They really feel good about what they're doing. So one of my early stories was about a small startup company from Calgary, Alberta, which is our energy capital. It's our Houston of Canada. is called Green Gate Power, and the guy's name was Dan Balaban. And he started building big wind farms when the economics were appalling, when the system barely accommodated them, when it really didn't sound like a terrific idea. And he left the job as a software developer who built software for the oil industry, which was like a license to print money at that time.
Right.
Yeah.
And, he left that for this seemingly hopeless business of renewable energy. And he started building wind farms. He was very creative. So in the beginning, when the economics of wind weren't as good, and when the only way you could make it work was through carbon credits, he actually sold carbon credits to California for his two first projects. One was the largest wind project in Canadian history, and the other one was the most northerly wind project on the continent. One was 300 megawatts, the other was 150. Those are pretty big wind farms, but the economics were made to work by selling the carbon credits to California, which, by the way, is not a great idea politically for you guys or for us. We're not getting the benefits if we sell them to California, and California decided that was a really bad idea at some point and won't let people buy them from that far away anymore, which is probably smart as well. But he got his company off the ground because he was creative, and
We have a little technical difficulty. It's kind of cutting it in and out on you just a little bit there. But you were in the middle of telling us about the entrepreneurs that work in this space and how inspiring they are, and that was kind of where we were before we lost you. So if you wanted to get back into that.
Yeah, so a guy I met, left the oil industry. He was selling software to the oil industry, which was an incredibly lucrative business. Because he wanted to do something a little more aligned with his view of the world, and so he started a wind company against all odds. And I don't know if we still have this, but he sold his carbon credits for his wind farms to California, and that's the only reason that made his early wind farms economic. But fast forward from there, after building the largest wind farm in Canadian history by being very innovative, very small company, last couple of years ago, wind in Alberta now is the cheapest form of electricity money can buy, and this has completely changed in 10 years. So we can build wind farms and enter into long-term contracts for something like 3.5 cents a kilowatt hour, which is incredibly cheap. It's like half the price of gas. And so now his latest thing is he's building the largest solar project in Canadian history right here in Alberta with no subsidies. And he's going to sell electricity for a rate that's about the price of wind. So now you can build wind farms and solar because it's the cheapest way to produce electricity. You don't have to do it because it helps climate change or it helps us with all these other environmental problems. No, you can do it because it's a really smart business decision.
It's the most cost-effective way to go.
And so my point is, as an entrepreneur, he's a very compelling entrepreneur. He's not afraid to fail, and he goes out and works hard. But he's mission-driven as well, and those two things together make a very powerful person. And they're very inspiring, and they make great stories. So I can't tell you how many times that cycle has been repeated in stories we've done because we found amazing people. Another guy I found in Saskatoon his name was Kent Rathwell, and he had a birdseed company. And he got this crazy idea that he wanted to create a carbon-free value chain for his birdseed company. He sells birdseed, when you feed the birds, sunflower seeds.
Yeah.
And so he wanted to create a carbon-free value chain. And so he started a company to make electric vehicle chargers. And he bought electric vehicles to drive around. And this was way ahead of the curve because nobody had electric vehicles when he started the company. And, in business school, they tell you the first thing you never do is don't try to drive demand with your entrepreneurial idea. Find a demand, like food or something that people actually need and satisfy that demand and get rich. No, he didn't do that. He had to actually raise the money to do each one of his sales. And he built one of the largest networks of vehicle chargers in the world here in Canada. You can go all the way across the country now. And most of them for free. You can charge for free just because of that drive. And now, obviously, that stuff's becoming much more important. The business is more important than it used to be. I just can't tell you how many inspiring stories like that I've come across.
That's so exciting that's what you're doing, that you're finding those stories and finding those people, because that's what's going to make this work. In the end, what's going to get us from where we are to where we need to be. It's I'd like to say it's those of us who want to help in our passion and believe, and we're part of it. But really, it's those people who are able to make it so viable for anyone, like so just easy, sensible, even the better option that will fix the problem. I mean, we keep going back to the electric car, right? To Tesla. I mean, that works because it's the coolest option. If you want the cool, fast, rad car that does the trick, that's what you get.
Yeah.
And that sort of changes the market. And then from there, once the market changes, it's like, okay, well now this isn't so unreasonable. It's not unsensible. It can be done. And it's neat to see that you're finding these stories, with wind farms and now solar, and then looking into, that's hilarious. I mean, birdseed into the largest, electric charging grid or stations in the world. I guess you're saying that's fantastic.
Yeah.
It's just cool.
It's funny you mention Elon Musk, because obviously he comes up quite often in the stories I do, especially when I do stories about transportation. But, you're right. Like, he transformed our thinking about the possibilities.
Right,
and that's
right.
really what I'm trying to do with this series. So prior to Elon Musk, people's idea of electric vehicles, there was a guy who owned a small company I ran across in Vancouver, and he started building these mini little electric cars, and this was way before Tesla. And they were like golf carts. And, he actually built them for the road. And then the government said, no, they're not capable enough. You can't drive those on the road. And that was kind of people's vision of electric cars.
Right,
sure.
Right.
Time. Glorified golf carts. And then this guy comes along, builds a sports car that can beat literally any gas car on the road. And it makes it so sexy, everybody in the world wants to own one. I personally cursed Elon Musk when he started. I said, what the hell? Like, I'm not going to be able to afford a $150,000 car.
Right.
Like, I'm selfish. I want to drive one of these.
Right.
But
but that's again, that's the passion of an entrepreneur, right? You start with that to get people to buy it, and then from that you can fund the cheaper ones, and then eventually,
I
and
don't
then
know
the
if you
competition
heard,
makes it.
but Elon Musk can now take credit for literally transforming the world, because as of last year, the electric car market until about a year ago consisted of half a dozen models, really, of any consequence. It was the Teslas occupying like 3 of the top 10 spots. And then there was the Leaf and what was the other one that you hear a lot of? Volts and Bolts and things like that.
Yeah. Sure.
But last year, the entire car industry has now moved. So there's a couple of stories out there about $300 billion in investment is now earmarked for electric vehicles. There are 700 models under development, due out mostly by 2025. So they're on the fast track. Volkswagen itself is investing, along with Audi and Porsche, their allies, $91 billion in electric vehicles. Literally their entire car lineup, they're developing 300 models themselves.
Yeah.
Of electric
that
cars.
changed the conversation right there, right?
Unbelievable. And
Because you have to compete.
And when the big guys start to turn, the big old, conventional companies, the Detroit companies start to change, you're over the hill, right? Because what's Ford doing? Well, you can already buy a Mustang that is almost designed to compete with the Tesla Model S. You're going to be able to buy a Ford F-150 within, I think, next year. We're over the hill. People may not realize this yet, but these things are going to come on fast and hard.
Well, and that's how you do it, right? I mean, you if you make the best product, then everyone else has to compete with the best product, and you've changed the market. And there it is.
That is awesome.
And that's what's exciting about what you're talking about with with wind being so cheap, right? So if you are creating energy for the least amount of money, and it's and you're making it reliably, and you can get plenty of it, well, then people are going to buy it.
Yeah.
Not because they care about the environment, although I'd love it if they did, but they'll be glad that they're taking care of the environment too. But that's not why they're buying it. They're buying it because it's the most sensible purchase. And in the end, that's how this thing's going to get solved. And it's cool to see people doing it.
Yeah.
Well, and you astutely alluded to the fact that people, they do make some consumer decisions for the environment, but really it's about 4 or 5% of the population that is activist enough to very specifically make those investments. Most of us just want to say
we're starting to have tech issues again.
Oh no!
I suppose we should probably try to wrap it up while we can.
Before we get stuck again.
We can talk to you forever, David. This was great. Thank you.
We really, really loved having you come on the show. I'm hoping we can at least hear you say a goodbye before you're gone. Are you still there?
I am, and I still have the recorder working, so I can still be here.
Well, we got a goodbye laugh. That made it through.
Yeah. Oh,
there you are. There you are.
I'm here still, and my recorder is still recording. So,
well, we loved having you come on the show, David. Please check out Green Energy Futures. All you got to do is search that name, and you'll pretty much see everything that he's got out there, from the show to the social media to the all the podcasts that you can listen to. It's really great stuff. So, we appreciate you coming on the show, and we look forward to keeping in touch, David. I hope you got to hear that little sign off from us.
Yes, thank you.
You know what's funny? I can see the yellow box going. There you are.
Yeah, there he is.
We can see the yellow box from Zoom going, saying that he's talking. He's
trying to speak.
But the
internet. Somebody needs to make a wind-powered internet. All right.
Awesome.
Well, should we just call it there?
Yeah.
Oh.
All right, bye. Thank you, David.
Thank you, David.
We'll have to call it. Should we do our sign off?
Let's do our sign off now.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
So we have been your beacon of light in a gloomy environment.
More than just charismatic megafauna.
Featuring parasympathetic nerve activity.
Nature is perfect. Look at eggs.
Dolphins don't quit.
Yes, and y'all inclusive.
We are y'all inclusive.
Even when the internet fails.
Yes.
Thank you guys so much for joining us on the Biofriendly Podcast this week. We really appreciate David Dodge, even though we had some tech problems there. But I think he said a lot of really great stuff, even with the cutting out. And really happy to have him on the show. So we look forward to keeping in touch with him and maybe having him back. And yeah.
Awesome.
All right, guys.
All right.
Thanks so much. See you next time.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.
It's the Biofriendly Podcast. It's the Biofriendly Podcast.